So hey, this is Jordan once again, and I just wanted to finish talking about the books I got recently at the LSU Book Bazaar. In the last video, I covered the stuff that I got on the first day, the Thursday when they opened, and I went back on Saturday, the final day of the sale, and got a couple of things, and then came back later in the last hours, only to find that everything had been cut in half. So I found even better deals. The first of which was a copy of the letters and poetry of the Brownings, which I was pretty excited about. I've always liked the kind of major poems of Robert Browning, and I've never owned a collection of either of the Brownings. But the kind of stuff that you tend to read in school, the My Last Duchess and Porphyria's Lover, always loved. Browning, obviously a master of the dramatic monologue, brought a lot of that very realistic psychology into that period of English literature and poetry. And I like the letters because they kind of give you a glimpse into the life of the poet and their thinking. And it's given me a chance to check out some of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry, which I wasn't too familiar with, and I've really been enjoying that. But speaking of letters, I got a copy of the selected letters of John Keats, another favorite poet of mine, someone whom I've read pretty widely, and I like the romantic poets in general, but Keats is a real favorite in particular. So that should be interesting. On a more general level, I got the Oxford Book of English Verse, and I got this, and I tend to get stuff like this kind of as a sampler, just to try to find something that I'm not familiar with, find a poem or a poet that looks interesting, because as I thumb through this, there are a lot of names that I haven't really even heard before, so definitely something to look through. On the more popular side, kind of dipping into some genre fiction here, a little bit more modern too. I got two books: The Bloody Crown of Conan and The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane, and a little bit of a Conan collection with the only Conan novel apparently. Conan is something that I have read before. I've got a number of books with the Conan short stories, but wasn't even really too aware that there was a novel. Except I think that I'd read that Robert Jordan had written a number of them, and that there was some previously existing material. But in any event, never read the Solomon Kane stuff before, so really looking forward to that. I like Pulp Fiction. I'm a speculative fiction reader and writer. I love science fiction and fantasy and horror, so that's gonna right up my alley. But okay, getting back to poetry, I got a collection of the sonnets of Edna St. Vincent Millay, very highly regarded, influential writer of her time period. Have not really read her that I know of, but I love sonnets. I love that form, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Speaking of classics, let me find the other one. I finally got a copy of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I've been reading her poetry, both just privately and on the channel. Really enjoying it. I think she's underrated, and figured it was time to get that because I've never read it. And I also got Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Two great works of English literature that I have never read, so I figured it was time to correct that. Going back a bit further in time, I got this 14th century verse and prose, and I think, as I explained in my last video, I tend to pick up pretty much anything I find on Middle English. Love that period of the language, but this one was pretty neat in particular because it had a lot of plays on top of the usual poetry that you tend to find in these. So I think finally, to kind of round it off, I got the Portable Emerson. Emerson is not one of my favorite authors. I'm not a big fan of transcendentalism. Was never a big fan of Thoreau, um, and Emerson, really made it a point to dog one of my favorite authors, Edgar Allan Poe. So, never been the biggest fan, but I figured, for 75 cents, it wouldn't hurt to have a copy. Get more familiar with it because, I've only read a pretty small bit of his, overall body of work. And so, on a somewhat similar note, I got the complete poems of Andrew Marvell and the complete poetry of Ben Jonson, both of which are not entirely tiny, as far as their font size, which is a good thing for my poor eyes. But both authors that I haven't really read too widely before, and it's something that I'd like to start doing on the channel, that kind of general time period, and I haven't yet, only because I'm not too sure about the details of the pronunciation of that, period in English. The kind of Jacobean and Elizabethan era. Obviously, when it gets down to it, there are some kind of nuances to the pronunciation that I need to look into a bit more before I feel comfortable reading it. And I actually can't remember if I already mentioned this one, so I apologize if I'm repeating. But the poems of Alexander Pope, nice hefty volume on this one. Unfortunately, the font is tiny. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's very certain to make my eyes bleed, and I don't know how well I'll be able to make it through that, but here's hoping, because he's obviously an interesting figure. But finally, on a kind of cool personal note, I was very surprised to find a copy of a very small edition of poems by the author A.D. Hope. Not an author I've read before. This is a guy who was recommended to me by my English professor in college as a kind of example of a modern English poet who maintained that sense of tradition, of traditional, stress-based English poetry, kind of in the same line as Dylan Thomas. But obviously a very different writer, as I've come to discover by looking through this a bit, and really fascinated, to check this out. Really glad to finally find a copy. I haven't really been able to track one down through all these years. But anyway, yeah, that's about it. I just wanted to share once again some of the cool, fun stuff that I find at these book sales, and I guess if you have anything that you'd like to ask me about, or if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And I guess in the meantime, just take it easy, and I will talk to you later.